Hello, everyone. We're happy to have you join us tonight. We're very excited to go into session 3 of the Virtues of Resistance. And I hopefully you're getting the videos. If you're having any problems getting the videos or the readings, just let me know. And I'm happy to resend them, but I'm trying to get them out within a couple of days after each session. So I'm very excited about tonight's session. It'll be really interesting. I'm going to turn it over to Amanda now. So take it away, Amanda.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's such a joy to be back with you, and in particular to delve into this session that has been titled, after a line from the reading, "We are negated as a category." And I'm so looking forward to our discussion on this one. The text that has been provided is a chapter, chapter 7, an excerpt from the memoirs of an important thinker of the 20th century named Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas was born in 1903 and he lived a long life. He died in 1993, and he lived a really dramatic and adventurous life during a really dramatic century. The 20th century turned out in all kinds of ways that, of course, he and nobody else could have foreseen. And I was introduced to him because, as a young undergraduate, I went to a political science professor and I indicated that I'm interested in bioethics. And this wise political science professor encouraged me to look up Hans Jonas. And I was immediately captivated by some of the book titles among Hans Jonas's works. The three main books that he wrote are The Phenomenon of Life Toward a Philosophical Biology. In that book, he talks about biological purposiveness. What difference does it make that organisms tend towards certain ends, even at the level of biology, even before we get into ethics or teleology in that ethical sense, that there's a biological purposiveness to life? And throughout that book, he also speaks about making an existential interpretation of these biological facts. How do we discern that teleology derived from our biology? So I found that very interesting. The next book in the series of three philosophical books that I explored of his is titled The Imperative of Responsibility: In Search of an Ethics for a Technological Age. And there he was contending with all sorts of new technological developments and what significance they hold for human life, and specifically how responsibility can become a lens through which to navigate different ethical questions. He's really interested also in how we are the parents of our action, because parent means to bring forth. And so every person leaves a mark by their acts and is the kind of author of the moral acts that they kind of cause. And so I found that very interesting too. And then a third book in this trio that I studied as an undergraduate is titled Mortality and Morality in Search for the Good After Auschwitz. And so it's a fantastic trajectory from biology and science to ethics and technology to morality and religion and the higher things. And this was a really natural development for Hans Jonas in the course of his own life. But what captivated me more than anything was when I picked up his memoirs, which had only recently been put into English translation, and I was captivated by the realization that Hans Jonas really lived his philosophy. He lived what he discovered, and he discovered things because he had lived them. To my mind, there was this remarkable coherence in Hans Jonas of biography and philosophy. And given that he's such an interesting figure of bioethics who influenced people like Leon Kass and Carter Snead, who were on the President's Council of Bioethics, given that he's so pivotal, I think it's worth us paying attention to what kind of life did he live? What kind of questions did he choose to concern himself with? What kind of relationships? What kind of responsibilities? And that matters to us as we think about how does our life, how does the particularity, the facts of our existence lend itself to a certain uh, bioethical lens and to certain interests more broadly. So one thing that I found extremely interesting is that Hans Jonas, from a young age, had a thirst for adventure. He was born in 1903, as I mentioned, and before the First World War had happened, the only other key events that had really happened in world events in his memory had been the sinking of the Titanic. And compared to the events that he had studied in history and looking at what he considered to be a charmed life, even as a child in the country that had known nothing but peace for decades and was flourishing economically at the time. He was a child in a well-situated family. I'm revisiting some notes from my thesis reflecting on the memoirs. He remembers that his life as a child felt a little bit boring. He wanted adventure. And he recalls when something of significance happened, it was always far away, and other people had the advantage of experiencing it up close, whether it was the soldiers and the civilian populations in the Balkans, or those passengers out in the middle of the ocean with the Titanic. But to me, it was a sad fate to have been born into a period and a world where everything was in tip-top order, and the only real excitement was to be found in history books and occasionally also in the paper. I certainly had such a feeling because I still remember with some shame the regret I felt at being denied the experience of living in an age of greatness, in which a person could display heroism, in which there were victories, perhaps also defeats, but at least something important was happening, something I could experience directly or even play a role in. And of course, it would be a hero's role, maybe even a sacrificial role. I didn't assume that I would escape unscathed. What mattered was that something was happening. And that brings us to the opening of this chapter, where on his 40th birthday, he's hearing this poem written expressing that same yearning for these sort of glorious days of adventure and heroism. And then he brings us to this occasion where, at the beginning of the Second World War, he is filled with this pathos that he admits having had since childhood to play a heroic role when the occasion calls for it, even if it will be sacrificial. And he immediately begins to recognize that this is our war. As a Jew, as a German Jew, he sees this as the most rousing and apparent call for him to rise to the occasion in what has become an existential threat to not only Jews there, but to Jews worldwide. And he then makes this rousing appeal and exhorts Jews of the world, beginning in a kind of living room salon and an apartment, distributing his letter to take up arms and to fight, because he says, "For we are negated as a category of human beings. No other people is in this situation." It's a world that began to expand in which Jewishness had no right to be. And so he has this entire excerpt in the text that we read in this chapter, and he's hoping that this will be galvanizing. He thinks that for the sake of our self-respect and the respect of the world, we can prove that we are not pariahs and outcasts, helplessly swallowing their pain, but rather men who know how to take responsibility for their lives and to strike back. But just a few lines earlier, he's describing also how a kind of fatalism was settling in and paralyzing us. This fatalistic certainty that the fate was inescapable. So this tension between the rousing responsibility and a sense of foreboding doom was all around. Then he has these very interesting sections in his appeal where he describes the Second World War as the first war of religion in modern times. And it's because Jews are, as Dietrich von Hildebrand would put it, the metaphysical representative of humanity. And Jonas brings in similar language, speaking about how Christianity too was made a target of its metaphysical anti-Semitism. It's being with reference to the shorthand he uses, normally Hitlerism, throughout the piece. And he thinks that defeating Hitler is a good enough goal for now. He says there's no justification for thinking too much further ahead because we don't even know if we will win. We have to keep our focus simply on survival, simply on defeating Hitler, and that is a goal enough to galvanize us all around. Now he's thinking that this will be convincing. He is hoping at the outset of the war that there will be an all-Jewish legion recruited from Jews all throughout the entire diaspora. And he says, unless we are sorely mistaken about the Jews' sense of honor, these refugees will be particularly receptive to this call to arms, indeed, will be awaiting it with impatience and will answer it with enthusiasm. But it does not quite work out like that. He is thinking for himself. He is asking, what am I prepared to do? And thinking this is a very human decision. Again, no further basis is needed. The annihilation of Hitler is sufficient purpose. But as he found, with all of this appeal, the reactions were kind of tepid, both among those to whom he spoke, and among those militaries that were pitched with his proposal that they would fight alongside a British army or with the Jewish insignia, but alongside the British army. And this is what he was hoping for, and it was rebuffed with things like, "We'll handle things as we see fit." He says, "Alas, mine was a private initiative with far too little authority behind it." And from the Jewish agency, he says, "From that quarter, I too received no encouragement." So this whole chapter is about his zeal, his sense of responsibility, his desire to rouse the Jews closest to him, but also around the world. And it doesn't really work until eventually it does. And coming toward the end of this chapter, he describes the conclusion really just months before the end of the war, when finally Churchill realized the moral significance of the Jewish cause and our participation in the war, and over the resistance of his generals, ordered that our units, scattered among the various branches of service, be joined into a single military entity. Thus, in September 1944, the Jewish Brigade Group officially came into existence. And Churchill even ordered that we should receive our own insignia, blue and white with the Star of David embroidered in gold. Deployed in the last stages of war, and what a kind of vindication of Jonas's dreams, of his sense of responsibility, and of his hope about the Jewish confidence to rise to the occasion. He says of his former initiative that his efforts were backed by only a small group of enthusiastic amateurs who had thought it was possible to take on and implement something like this without much organization. We flattered ourselves in this undertaking, thinking that it would have an instant appeal to Jewish pride and Jewish capacity for self-sacrifice, and that young Jewish men who were waiting impatiently for their chance would flock to us. We'd miscalculated, however, and no Jewish organization had wanted to support us. So look at this alternation from a living room pitch, from leaflets distributed in German, from him trying to propose this rousing appeal to responsibility, and then really all these years later, being able to actually serve in a Jewish brigade. This was midway on his journey through life, and he comes to the end of the chapter talking about how he continued his philosophical work, which the earlier work he had done, as he alludes to, was on Gnosticism, ancient Gnosticism, before he got into those three books I mentioned. So really a long, robust scholarly career. In fact, when he was 16, he wrote a kind of mini dissertation on the prophets. So this is a very philosophical man who describes that even while he was, even during the war years, he sent love letters, some didactic letters to his wife. And he says, "Far from books, lacking any materials for scholarly research, I was thrown back on the question that should actually preoccupy every philosopher, namely the question as to the meaning of our existence and the existence of the world around us. So I began to wonder what it implies in ontological terms that there are organisms and what significance the nature of organic being holds for life, including the nature of consciousness, emotion, and of the spirit. All of this I developed in letters. And so fascinating. What a life. What a meandering trajectory, but also what a coherent life of sensing this profound responsibility, of yearning for happenings, of having those boyhood desires for a glorious time, and then just waiting with this preparation to then take charge, being met with disappointment, being met with the rejection of his ideals and ideas, but eventually having this vindication of what he had deemed such an adequate response to the evil of his own time. And that is, I think, a very interesting backdrop against which to consider his contributions to bioethics. I do think it matters very much what the people we study and the people to whom we listen, how did they live? Was it with integrity? What's their story? And again, I chose Hans Jonas when I was just starting out in my studies as an ethical exemplar because of my attraction to this very coherence. So with that, we can delve together into his letter, and I look forward to your reflections on this structure of human experience that he outlines and what resonances you find with it in your own lives.